Hey, so I'm Daniel Linder, call me Daniel. I consider myself to be an expert in the fields of addiction, recovery, and relationships. As I've studied, written about it, treated addictions, treated relationships for over 30 years and have my own addiction recovery experience. I'm excited right now because this is the dawning of a new age. In this video, I'm going to introduce a new paradigm for understanding and treating addiction. And that is the relationship model of addiction. My vision is that the relationship model replace the disease concept as the prevailing standard for understanding and treating addiction. It's simply a case of natural succession. As great as the disease concept was and still is in many respects, it's become an old horse. It just no longer serves as an adequate way of explaining what addiction's all about and how to treat it effectively. In order to really appreciate the relationship model, you need to have a perspective on how the disease concept evolved into the relationship model. Let me take you back to the early 50s. 1952, 1953 was when it all started. This was when the American Medical Association proclaimed that alcoholism was a disease, like cancer, like a cold, like diabetes. When they did this, it literally rocked the world in the world of alcoholism and treatment. It was a time when ignorance prevailed. There was a strong stigma that was attached to alcoholism. That means that alcoholics were viewed as weak-willed, morally flawed, defective individuals who were basically shunned by society. So this enlightened approach freed up hundreds, maybe thousands of alcoholics to come out and admit that they had a problem with alcohol and that they needed help and to seek help. So we could see this was the first big impact, and maybe the most important impact that the disease concept had, because it served to dispel the stigma that was associated with alcoholism. When it dispelled the stigma, it made it possible for so many people to view alcoholics and relate to alcoholics with compassion rather than revulsion. It humanized alcoholism. It was putting out the message and promoting the understanding that alcoholism was a disease that can be treated, that there's nothing wrong with you other than that you have this condition, and that there is treatment and you can get better. So it was great. It was a whole new attitude, whole new perspective. Let's talk about how and why the disease concept was so tremendously helpful to the health professionals at the time and continued to be, to the point that it was the standard. It became the standard of treatment and understanding addiction for the next 6 decades until this present day. It was huge. So, and this is what the clinicians were able to use now. Whenever they were with an alcoholic, they would have a working definition of what alcoholism is. So alcoholism was defined as a pathological dependence. It was pathological because you were simply out of control. No matter how miserable your life was and what all that happened to you while you were drinking, the problems that resulted, the severity of those problems, you could not stop drinking. You were simply out of control. That's the pathological part of the dependence, loss of control. Alcoholism was deemed a disease, defined as a disease, because it met specific criteria that qualified a disease as such. And those criteria are primary, progressive, and permanent. And so there's a gene part of it that they're talking about. There's a belief that if your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents are alcoholic, then you're going to be much greater risk of becoming alcoholic yourself. And there's also a biochemical understanding for what the cause of alcoholism is. And it was believed that there is some chemical, the presence of some kind of chemical in your body when mixed with alcohol creates an extraordinarily pleasurable, euphoric experience that becomes irresistible. And The biochemical explanation or understanding of how that happens is that when you drink, there's a release of dopamine that goes off in the brain, in the pleasure centers of the brain, and when this happens, you have this experience of pleasure, enhanced elevation. That's what the high, that's what the effect of alcoholism, the alcohol does to you. So these are basically how alcoholism, the cause of alcoholism, is explained from the disease concept perspective, all genetic, biochemical. We could also see the influence of behaviorism in there, because human beings are kind of seen as laboratory rats, likened to Pavlov's dogs, that basically we're creatures of habit conditioned by positive reinforcement. So the pleasurable effects of alcohol set the alcoholic up to go on and just seek the positive reinforcement, like we're like robots or laboratory rats, and don't really go much deeper into it and looking for other explanations as to how that happens, other than we're creatures of habit and it's positive reinforcement. Feels good. So we're dead. We're dead in the water if it feels good. We're hopelessly hooked. So treatment from the disease concept perspective. The treatment of the disease of alcoholism begins by establishing sustained stabilization of sobriety as the first step in the treatment process, and generally relies on education and peer support programs as the primary treatment modalities. Pretty much almost every treatment facility, every treatment program in the country incorporates Alcoholics Anonymous into the treatment regimen. And this is because Alcoholics Anonymous is an organization and an association or affiliation that had grown sort of pretty much at a parallel time frame with the disease concept. So in the disease concept, when the American Medical Association proclaimed alcoholism to be a disease, around this time, Alcoholics Anonymous gave birth and grew exponentially every decade, and it's really big. Hundreds of thousands of people are involved in AA, and AA provides the alcoholic with a place to go where he's going to be welcomed, supported, and be around other people struggling with the same affliction. It gave the alcoholics a sense of community, a place where they feel a part of, where they're comfortable, accepted, protected, and supported being alcoholic. It's like a little niche within society where they can share, connect, and grow together and go through their struggles and recovery together. It's like no other place. There's no other place to go for that. In addition to the peer support part of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's also the 12 steps. The 12 steps is a spiritual component that's incorporated into the program. And the spiritual part of it, I'm sure you've heard of the higher power. And the higher power gives the alcoholic an option when it comes to him really struggling, confronting the fact that he's powerless. It gives him an option where he no longer has to rely on his willpower, but rather he can trust that he can't drink, he's out of control, and that he doesn't have to struggle with it anymore, and he doesn't have to feel badly because he can't control it. So that higher power is a way of getting to a place of where I'm just not going to drink because I can't, rather than getting into all the reasons why and that, what does that mean about you? It's just, you can't, and just trust in the higher power that you're going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay if you're not drinking. So that was one big part of the 12 steps. If you're working in a Alcoholics Anonymous, it's very common where you're going to be working with a sponsor and specifically doing working with the 12 steps and applying the 12 steps to your own experience, and you're doing intensive self work. So it's a process of self-examination where you're encouraged, where you learn how to take responsibility for yourself and make amends to all the people that have been hurt by your addiction. It encourages you to reach out constantly for support amongst the peers. Also, it encourages you to commit to a lifelong commitment of staying in the program and continuing to put out the message and welcome new people in and continue keeping the program alive that way and keeping your own recovery alive through a lifelong commitment of continuous engagement in the program. So I remember when all of this was great. All of this gave me a lot to work with as a health professional, as well as help so many other professionals. But while that being said, I remember when I started really having problems with the disease concept, where I was feeling, you know what, I'm just not getting the whole picture here. And what was bothering me the most was that there was never really any mention of the mental, emotional, psychological, and relationship factors that could play into addiction. And I thought this was a blatant omission. I thought, how could this be possible? But I came to understand that maybe there's some politics involved in it, that the American Medical Association wielded a lot of power, and it was all based in the scientific method. And mental, emotional, psychological, and relationship factors were probably considered to be too subjective, immeasurable, and therefore not valid for such consideration. So it was completely ignored. So this was a problem for me. Along with, it was also apparent that when the cause of alcoholism is attributed to genetic and biochemical factors, there were many exceptions all the time cropping up with people who would meet the criteria, who would either have that gene or have generations of alcoholics in their family, or have that chemical in their body, but never go on to become alcoholic. And there are many people without those markers that end up becoming alcoholic. So these exceptions just were not explained from the disease concept. And then additionally, while I was working with addictions, alcoholism was obviously not the only addiction. There were other substances, and I started doing a lot of work with porn addiction, sex addiction, love addictions, codependency, compulsive gambling. These other addictions, the non-chemical addictions, are known as process addictions. And it was clear to me that there was a lot more. Since there was no chemical involved in many of these process addictions, the physical basis or the physical explanation for how they got addicted was just not cutting it. So I took all of this, I took all this in. I was wanting to come up with I wanted to develop a way of understanding addiction that included the physical aspects of it, because I thought that a lot of it, like I said, was really solid and progressive, but also extremely limited and so in many ways misleading. So I developed the relationship model of addiction, and which basically picks up where the disease concept leaves off. The relationship model of addiction, from that perspective, all addictions, alcoholism included, are not primarily physical in nature. They are emotional in nature. And the definition of addiction from the relationship model perspective is that addiction is a relationship with a means of relief, of pain from unconscious, unmet emotional needs stemming from the early family of origin relationships or current relationships that fail to provide the nourishment that we need. So when the implication here is that so when you've come from a family and you don't get your needs met, your emotional needs like need to be loved, need for attention, to feel special, need to be heard, need to be understood, need to feel part of, need to feel like you're making a difference, need to feel safe. All of these basic human needs, when they're not met, there's frustration and pain that results. And the greater the pain, the greater the need to relieve that pain. We know this, you don't have to be a doctor, it's nothing scientific about it. When you're in pain, whether it's physical or emotional, there's one thing that you're motivated to do, and that is to relieve the pain. So the greater the pain, the greater the need to relieve the pain, the greater the need to relieve the pain, the more desperate you're going to be for relief. And you will eventually settle on whatever means of relief that you find that's the most convenient, the most accessible, the most effective, the most immediate, all of that. So you will find that and get hooked on that and form this relationship. So from the relationship model of addiction, the cause of addiction are relationships, growing up, family of origin, or even current relationships that fail to provide the emotional nourishment that you need. And the pain that results is the underlying driving force of the addiction because there's a need for relief. Now, if you just think about it, and this was something that was never really covered or addressed from the disease concept perspective, this part about pain and the effect that, this extraordinary effect that was attributed to genetic and biochemical factors. I don't think it has anything to do with the genetic and biochemical factors. The pain creates a need for relief, and these substances or activities provide a mind and mood altering effect. They make you feel better. They either relieve the pain, give you a way of escaping the pain, making you feel better, just making you feel different, the way you want to feel and would prefer to feel. It's an emotional process, basically. So the treatment, from the relationship model perspective, the treatment of alcoholism and all addictions begins the same way as it does with the disease concept. In order to grow, to get healthy, to have a fulfilling life, where you're not at risk of self-destruction, first step is a sustained stabilization and sobriety. So that's the same as the disease concept. However, that's just the beginning part of recovery. After that, there's a stage of recovery that involves intensive self-work, where you get yourself back together and you get tuned into yourself and you can feel your feelings and bring those feelings into your life and come from that place when you live and express yourself. And so if you accept the premise of the relationship model that the cause of addiction are dysfunctional or unhealthy relationships that fail to provide the nourishment that you need and leaves a residue of pain and this desperate need for relief, it would naturally follow that recovery and treatment is a process of gaining the experience necessary and learning the skills that will empower you to create emotionally nourishing relationships. And as you do this, you will be undercutting the cause of the addiction, which is pain. Less pain, less need for relief, less addiction, more growth, more wholeness, more self-development. But thank you for your attention and your interest in this. And if you are interested in this, there's more where this came from.